this part I was going to kind of go very fast because these are very classic distinctions between quantitative and qualitative. It's a heuristic. It's helpful to see the two sides, but I don't think anything is purely quantitative or purely qualitative. So here is just one way of trying to introduce, and this is a classic from Einstein, and Einstein is being accused of plagiarizing from somebody else. So basically, the classic difference between quantitative and qualitative research is what counts cannot be counted, what can be counted doesn't count. Very nicely said. So we don't count things in qualitative research. Okay, we do single case studies, deviant case studies, so one is a number. I don't want a pattern of a distributional across. Okay? So anything that really counts cannot be counted. But if you do a quantitative study that you start to count tokens of X and Y, maybe it is very interesting pattern, but maybe it doesn't count towards anything. It doesn't answer anything because it's too decontextualized or not sensitive to what's going on. So here is a very classic way of trying to put the assumptions, the roles, the positioning of the researchers in these two different modalities, if you like, two different modes. So the kind of objectivity that Lars was talking about, the objective, the phenomena exists out there. So that would be a very quantitative view as opposed to the reality being more hermeneutic, phenomenological, constructed through our experience. In qualitative, we are more interested in the content. What is it that we want to understand? What is it that we want to find out? Whereas the primacy of the method, if the statistical test is correct, we don't care what we find because we have followed the method and the procedure. So in many ways, if you're not a quantitative researcher, you are more likely to move outside of the procedures and the steps. That's very qualitative. That's quite understandable. You can identify variables from the start and measure the relationships. In qualitative, they're very complex and you can't isolate them. They're all in there. So it's difficult to tease out which variable accounts, and that might be the reason you can't give a causal explanation about what something happened. Causality is not something that is the basis of qualitative study, and the ethic and the emic perspective, the point of view. So this is interesting, going back to the notion of the Luckmannian notion of point of view, how quantitative and qualitative researchers position themselves. So because the primacy of the method of the content is already a different axis. So that would be very interesting. So everybody has a point of view, but it's very different scale or the different place where you put it. You want to generalize, you want to predict, you want to give causal explanations in quantitative research. Okay. So do not frame a research question which resembles that, as if you can predict, as if you can explain, as if you are going to find a cause-effect relationship. Those are not qualitative research questions. We often do. As opposed to contextualizing, interpreting, understanding, again, the similar kind of terms from hermeneutics and phenomenology, you can see maybe the research question is how do I understand, not why something happens. How can we make sense of? Sense making. That might be much more aligned with a qualitative paradigm rather than a quantitative one. So sometimes our research questions might be looking the quantitative way, but we want to do qualitative research. And there's a classic study, I forget the reference now, when it was found that most qualitative research use a lot of quantitative language in their descriptions. So most people said, a high percentage said, actually you have got only 4 people. But you want to say high percentage because that sounds good. Most people said this was a dominant pattern, the dominant meaning 1 out of 5. So in other words, we use a language of quantification. the rhetoric of numbers. And actually, qualitative researchers do it more than quantitative researchers. Just an interesting observation. So you can see, and all these things should be very familiar, you keep your eyes fixed to the right-hand column, okay? Because that's what we think. That, as I said, you end with hypotheses, you end with questions and speculations. You think that the issues or the topics or the themes or the findings would emerge. You are an important instrument in the research, not in quantitative studies. Those would be statistics and questionnaires. And more naturalistic, more inductive rather than deductive. You are looking for patterns rather than just distribution and content. You seek complexity, and it's very descriptive in its write-up, unlike the more abstract. And finally, the roles of the researcher would be very different, and that's very important to move into my researcher positioning topic. That in a quantitative you are more detached and impartial, more objective, whereas you're bound to be involved and subjective, intersubjective in your qualitative research. It's more objective portrayal rather than empathic understanding. But at the same time, we should not think that all research in applied linguistics has to be qualitative. Of course not. So language communication research can be both quantitative or qualitative or mixed, as many people are trying to do. Whichever way you go, the two important concepts methodologically, reliability and validity, they apply to both paradigms. Is your research reliable? Are your findings valid, credible? You can't escape that, whether you are doing a case study, ethnography, observational study, recordings of classrooms or so on, and doing discourse analysis. You still have to address, is my data reliable, my method reliable? Are my claims valid, credible? So when we talk about inter-rater reliability, if you're doing coding of your data, so two people code and you say the inter-rater reliability is very good, 99%. So then we can reliably take your findings to whatever that means. In qualitative research, what is often called inter-analyst validity, not reliability. So can two analysts trained in the same tradition, whether it is corpus linguistics or dialogicism or conversation analysis, doesn't matter. Let's take two analysts trained in the same tradition of analysis, whether they agree on what is the finding, what is the result. If they can't, then we have a problem of validity, because two analysts don't agree. Of course, people coming from different analytic traditions will never agree. That's interesting. If I am a corpus linguist and you are a critical discourse analyst, there is very little we can agree on, but it's amazing how many people try to combine these two traditions in PhD research. Huge. It has become a bandwagon. My research is corpus-assisted critical discourse analysis. That's the term. Okay, so this is very interesting how these things have panned out. We're talking about disciplinary divisions and breakups and so on, like cell structure, how cells divide and form themselves into independent cells. The same things are happening methodologically as well. So there are methodological parallel to the theoretical interdisciplinarity. We can talk about inter-methodological issues. This is a key concept that I like and use very much from Aaron Sickerel, what he calls ecological validity. It's very difficult to have validity as we understand it in the quantitative paradigm. So what Sickerel talks about is we can never get validity like quantitative studies, experimental studies, but we can approximate, come closer to what he calls ecological validity. That whatever we are saying on the basis of our data and analytical frameworks, it is credible, it's believable, that it has something to stand on. And how can we achieve that? There are many ways. First, let's try and do some longitudinal data, because we become too much engrossed and fascinated by cross-sectional data because we don't have time, we don't follow people. So let's just take one fragment, say whatever we like. Have you gone back to the same organization over 3 years? So that would make it more ecologically valid, because you have observed something ecologically over a period of time, even if 3 years. Let's go to this social worker and the client and the counseling, but I have done the same one 5 times. So that gives me a little bit of more of a handle to say something about that particular pair, because it's longitudinally relevant. You can also have different types of data, primary and secondary data, but I have some questionnaires, I have some interviews, but I'm primarily going to focus on the recordings. So not all data have the same priority and the same weight. That's perfectly fine. So that gives you some ecological validity, because you can triangulate different data sources. Of course, you can also triangulate different analytical frameworks. I look at it from this approach and from that approach. So having looked at it from 3 approaches, I hope what I say is more credible. And finally, you can also ask the participants, and this is becoming what is called respondent validity in biomedical research, that your research has to be validated by the respondents, that they have read it. They may not agree with what you have said, but they have read and they can register their disagreements. And you have to produce that as part of your publications. Very much in biomedicine and medical research, not so much in here, but we always try to triangulate and go back, get feedback from our participants. Do you think my interpretation is okay, or do you disagree? And if they disagree, let them write down why, put it in the appendix, and that's good practice. Both paradigms have weaknesses, okay? And that's very important, that we don't become too arrogant on the basis of what we do is right. So quantification studies are very costly, they take time, they need more human resources, but they systematically disregard context. They can't engage with the context of utterances, the context of things. They can't contextualize enough. So they're insensitive to context. Okay? As opposed to qualitative studies, it's too context sensitive. So it is so context sensitive, only you can understand it, nobody else can. Can you see the problem? The more interpretative you become, the less communicative you are. And the more we think qualitative research is driven by interpretation. Actually, it's an interpretive science. So for me, in a sum, qualitative research is interpretation. And that interpretation is point of view, my background, my career, the way I have been trained and experienced. So now I'm interpreting it to such an extent, no wonder many of the philosophical interpretations go over our heads because we can't understand them, because it's too interpretive. There are very nice ways of characterizing qualitative research. A very famous ethnometrologist and ethnographer is the very first one who combined ethnography with conversational analysis. Michael Moorman wrote a book called Talking Culture. And he says qualitative research is basically trying to understand a whole society in a grain of rice. So one case is enough to prototypically manifest what is it that we want to hear and know about the pattern in a particular culture. It is a kind of an approach that can reach those parts of life, those parts of activities, the phenomena that other parts can't, other methods can't reach. So there are certain questions quantitative research can't ask and answer. Just like there are certain things qualitative research cannot ask and answer. So other methods, by that I mean quantitative, experimental, survey-based, register-based research. So to me, qualitative research, qualitative inquiry is essentially interpretation-driven. So how good you are as an interpreter. I don't mean interpreter in the mediation, multilingual setting. How much training do we need to be interpreters of text, of talk, of language, of meaning? And interpretation equals thick description in Clifford Geertz terms. So how thickly can you describe a phenomenon? People would say these two approaches, quantitative, qualitative, are not antithetical. They are complementary, but we can't assume complementarity because there's a lot of skepticism from both sides, both camps. Quantitative people don't like qualitative researchers. They just don't want to smell them. Qualitative researchers can't stand the discourses of numbers because the people don't become people anymore, they become numbers. So there are huge amounts of divide between these paradigms. So basically the take-home message is when you are trying to do mixed method, be aware, because epistemologically they are very different paradigms.